Hi there. So I wanted to share with you the concept of coherence and collective healing because it's so central to my journey and what I've discovered along the way. This is Baloo. You want to say hi, Baloo? Say hi. Say hi, Baloo. All right. So let me start with coherence. And I first heard about this from a company called HeartMath, which is focused on a number of things around awareness and coherence. And I'll start with a little story that I read in their book about the research. So there's the guy that invented the pendulum clock. His name was Hans Christensen. He had a wall full of clocks, and he added a new clock. And then he noticed it was out of sync with all the others. So he left, came back, they were all in sync. So he thought, that's interesting. He messed one of them up again. And then after a while, they were all back in sync. He never figured it out, but what they discovered 30 years later is that the clock or the oscillator that had the largest sound wave, the largest clock on the wall, was the one that had all of them, the rest of them would synchronize to. So what they also found that in the human system, the largest oscillator is the heart, and all the other systems that have any rhythms are trying to synchronize to the heart. So you think about it like hormonal and respiratory and menstrual and nocturnal, like sleep cycles. All of these things have rhythms to them, and they're all trying to synchronize. And what they found was that when you're in a state of stress or accumulated stress, especially, the heart rhythm is erratic. And when you're in a place where you're calm, you could be happy, but you're calm. There's a smooth rhythm of the heart. So and if you imagine if it's like an erratic rhythm, then it's like cacophony. All these other systems are not able to regulate and like synchronize with the heart. And so it's like, they said the analogy was like, you put your foot on the brake and the pedal at the same time, the car will move forward, but there'll be huge amounts of wear and tear. Versus like a state of coherence, they called it, where everything synchronizes. So when you have a smooth heart rhythm, everything can synchronize. You move to a state of coherence where heart, mind, body synchronize and they're coherent. And then, everything works optimally as it should. And then they found that the two fastest ways to get to a state of coherence was gratitude, which was surprising to me that there was actually research around that. It's awesome. And regulated breathing. So the regulated breathing, I think they said 6 to 8 breaths per minute, which is like 10 breaths in a minute, like in and out in a minute, would get you to a state of coherence. Interestingly, 6 to 8 hertz, cycles per second, or per minute, is theta state, which I've talked about before, is the healing state. So I think coherence is also flow, is also theta state, same place. Anyway, so that's one thing that's really interesting. So if you can start a gratitude practice, like that's something I started doing with the kids. We would start out, we'd have little gratitude journals. I let them pick out their journals, and we would all do this. And in the beginning, they couldn't think of anything to think about. Like they were like, I don't know what to be grateful for. And I don't care if it's the color of your pen. Just write something down, like a few things that you're grateful for. And then after a while, after a few months, like they had so many things. Because what starts happening is, they would initially couldn't think of anything. But then during the day, they'd be like, oh, I'm going to put that on my list. And then after a while, your perspective starts to shift. You start looking for things, and you start becoming more grateful in general. And perspective shifting is a really big part of this journey, the ability to see other perspectives. So, those are two practices to consider. But anyway, going on with coherence now. So group coherence or collective healing, really, really powerful concept because, well, let me just share what it is first, and I'll share why it's so powerful. So I was introduced to it in a number of ways. I initially found it when I used to walk. I always walk and talk. When I'm talking to friends on the phone, I'm always walking. And I started noticing, like, when I would pace, or walk as I'm like walk around or whatever, as I'm talking, my friends and I, we'd be talking about stuff that we're worried about or problems we're having or whatever. And then suddenly we start getting these ahas, like insights we'd start getting. And we'd be like, it'd be really cool if, and we'd say something we wanted to happen. Then we started noticing like those things would start to happen. And then after a while, it's like, wait a minute. And what I realized was happening was we were getting into a state of collective coherence. Now, I've seen this in groups, small groups that I've done this with, and with another individual. And this is how it works. So if you're in a group and you move into a state of flow or coherence, what seems random to me, I might share. And then it triggers something for you, and you're like, oh, that reminds me of. And then, and pretty soon, it's like pieces of a puzzle. Stuff that I'm bringing up actually gives you the ahas to solve some of your problems and mine, and we can potentially solve a common problem, something we're trying to go after. And I was seeing this in the workplace. And it's almost like we end up with a hive mind. That's what they say collective healing group coherence is. You end up with almost like a hive mind. Not almost. You actually end up with a collective mind or a hive mind So what one person may not be able to solve, when you start getting more people, 2 people, more people, it's like you're bringing all of the intelligence and knowledge together. So now when you start connecting to a state of coherence or flow, you can leverage and start to connect dots and potentially make progress or solve. So this is something that we were testing in the workplace in a number of ways, and that was really fascinating. So the way I experienced this so part of what we were playing around with a group of people. If we're all walking or talking, we're like, let flow whatever wants to flow. You could even do this, like one of the ideas that I had was like, you could do this with a particular problem in the world, and then you could get experts in the space into a state of coherence or flow, and then see if they're able to identify root causes, develop deeper insights, and potentially then solve or make progress on some of these bigger issues. And so we were playing around with that. But anyway, going to what Thomas Hubel does, and one of the programs that I did with him, the trauma-informed certification and coaching program. And in that one, like the first session we went to was in person. What was interesting was, and I was working with him even when I was at Google, so we got to see some of this in action at Google. What we find is that the more work you do on self, the more grounded you are, the more like you're a larger self because you've integrated your fragmented parts. And as you continue to do that, as I found with Michael Levin's research, is like every cell wants to connect to other cells and solve bigger problems. So when you heal and collect a lot of your fragments into a collective whole, you start seeking connection with others. That's why when you do this type of work, collective healing, like you're even doing it within ourselves. You think about it, like Michael Levin talked about this, right? We started as a single cell. We became a multicellular organism. When we have trauma, a group of cells will fragment, like a tumor cell that has a separate goal in the collective. If you have enough fragments, then you end up with less collective intelligence. Every fragment, when it gets triggered, the trauma gets triggered, it has its own set of goals, its own priorities, its own beliefs. Your conscious mind shuts down, your higher self, and there's fragments running the show. So it's got smaller intelligence, essentially. So as you heal, you end up with a larger collective intelligence. You can solve bigger problems, and that's what I started encountering. I was able to solve bigger and bigger problems, so deal with the most toxic programs, the most difficult characters, etc. in the workplace, and in any realm that I was operating in. I was able to deal with more because I was able to, because I collected more of the cells and was more whole and connected to my higher self. I was able to feel into and solve and see, a lot more about what was going on. So that was part of the reason that I was in the first video, why I left Google, was what I was starting to see in the workplace. But what we saw there, and so the other thing that's also happening then is, as I mentioned in a previous video, as you heal the fragments, the definition of self actually starts to expand. So the way this plays out is, as I keep healing myself, I start feeling more connection to others. Instead of being in more fight or flight, when any of these traumas get triggered, these fragments, you basically end up, it's a version of fight or flight. And that's all about survival. So you can't really think about other or think of other. And if you have a lot of fragments, a lot of trauma, you're always getting triggered, you're always focusing on self. But what I started discovering was, as I started healing the trauma, connecting reconnecting the fragments to the whole, the whole, then basically what I started experiencing was I started being able to feel other people having empathy. I was able to start resilience. I was able to come back to center more quickly. My magnitude, duration, frequency, my emotional responses started coming down. So I started I'd be able to tune in to what other people were feeling, thinking, saying, doing, etc. I was able to absorb more. Because I cleared the filters and lenses of my trauma, the data coming in wasn't getting distorted, so what I spit out was more resonant, right? So it's this is what the things that start to happen. I started caring more about as this kind of went on. Before I was so self-absorbed, I didn't care about the climate, or I didn't care about other people. If there was a war that was happening, I was wow, that's really sad, but I wouldn't feel it. And what started happening over time was, as I healed more, essentially then you start being able to connect to others, because you become almost like a single cell that's now seeking to connect with others, and so and that's our natural state. Natural state. And so essentially then I started being able to feel also more, because I wasn't as triggered and self-absorbed here, survival. I was able to feel more what was happening out there and what's happening with others. So I started feeling for the climate and for the environment. I started caring more about humanity and wanting to help. And what they say in Vipassana is that as you heal the sankharas and release the sankharas, the natural state of the mind is compassion, goodwill, and love. So naturally, that's what I started to experience without trying anything. You remove the excess, and our natural states are actually to connect with others, to solve bigger and bigger problems, to have compassion, goodwill, and love. So that's exactly what I started to experience. So when I took this program with Thomas Hubel and Elizabeth Fox, the first round that we did, the first session, was in person. And what we witnessed there that was so fascinating was, so what I noticed even when I was working with Thomas at Google was that because he's cleared so much, and he can expand, his self is like, everyone in the room, he can co-regulate, this concept of co-regulation, right? So when you get stressed, it triggers within me any resonant frequency sankharas or traumas in my system. So I start getting, my nervous system starts to agitate. If I don't have the resources to ground that and release it, then we're escalating each other. Because I'll say something that's like not my best self, right, my worst self, and it triggers you, and then keeps going up. And that's why you see couples or individuals at work or whatever fight over the same things and just keep escalating. But if you have someone that can regulate and ground, then the other person can actually co-regulate with them, and they can both come to a place of calm and then talk about whatever they want to talk about. So Gottman even talked about this. He was like, Gottman is James Gottman, I think James Gottman. He's a therapist that works with couples and families. One of his breakthrough findings was like he had this thing called the Love Lab, where he would have these couples and he would say, okay, and one-way glass, it was like a living room, and they'd be sitting there, and he'd say, I want you to talk about things you guys normally argue about. He would go behind the wall, see them, they can't see him. And they would be hooked up with a bunch of biometrics, like data, looking at like pressure, like heart rate, and like pressure, blood pressure, and like perspiration, et cetera, et cetera. So looking for signs of stress. And then they inevitably get into an argument. And what he found was that they would get to a point what you call flooding, where you're like, totally into fight or flight. Your conscious mind shut down, your subconscious is taken over, and you're going to say and do things you're going to regret. So what he then did was he went in the middle of that when they were flooding and said, hey guys, time out. We're having a little technical difficulties. I need you to stop this argument, read magazines or whatever. Wait until I let you know when we're back online. Went back, waited until the metrics all came back to baseline. Then he went back out and said, okay, go ahead. And then the outcome of that discussion was completely different because they were in a place of calm. So, same kind of thing. If you can actually find a way to co-regulate or down-regulate, self-regulate, and then have the conversation, right? You can have, your conscious mind is online. You can have a much more productive conversation. Anyway, going back to this. So the more you ground and clear, the more you become a co-regulative force, because your definition of self can expand. So essentially then, what happens is in a group, let's say we're in a group, and let's say I've cleared a ton. So I can co-regulate with a lot more people without getting triggered. I have the resources to do that. So essentially then, in my presence, or so let's say someone says something, or just simply by being, if you're with a person who's really down or great, kind of grounded, your trauma will start to come to the surface. Your subconscious will feel safe, because essentially it's almost like the vibrational frequency in the space. And my definition of expands to include you. You can feel the calm. And so then your trauma will naturally start coming to the surface, or something will trigger you, whatever. And then essentially then, as you get triggered, because I can stay or get grounded quickly, you can then co-regulate. And so this is what happens, peer to peer. And what happens as soon as someone regulates with me, let's say, now they become part of the healing current, or whatever you want to call it, the co-regulative force. So it becomes even easier for the third person or the fourth person, whatever. So what I experienced then was this live. We were in the session with them. And remember, it was on the second day, after people had been co-regulating with me now for a day, right? So their systems are feeling safer and safer. Their trauma starts to come up to the surface. And then one person freaked out on the second day, totally lost it, was in a state of rage. And everyone was like, oh my God, what is Thomas going to do? And so he got up and he took the mic. He was very calm. Everyone was on the edge of their seats wondering how he was going to respond. And he came to the middle of the room, and it was no, actually he said, do you mind if I come closer to you? And the person's like, yeah, sure. So he came to the middle of the room. And then he seemed grounded, lightning rod grounded. And he just stood there. And he said, I agree with you. And the person then started spewing more stuff in total anger. And then there was a really long pregnant pause. And then and he was just standing there. And then he said, I can feel your pain, and it hurts me. And it was so genuine. There was no lip service here. Every fiber of his being matched these words that you could feel. And then that person that was in a rage, I saw his shoulders slump, and he just looked like he calmed. And then Thomas said, after a really long pause, if you're open to it, I would love to share a meal together and talk about how we can leverage or incorporate the wisdom of your people into this program. And he was upset about something in the program. And that person, said it, whispered into his mic, I would really like that. And we were all floored. It was like watching a Jedi master. And then someone said, yeah, okay, you guys are fine, but there's a bunch of us that was really traumatic to watch and witness. I'm not fine. And so, he asked, what do you suggest? And the person suggested, why don't we let people who haven't processed what they need to process come up? And essentially what happened was people started coming up, and more people started getting triggered by what was being said. Pretty soon, like, half the room was like triggered. People were like yelling, screaming, crying in clusters, like all mayhem and murder. And Thomas was just sitting there. We're all wondering, like, what the hell is going on? Then what he started doing was, he would say, okay, if anyone wants to process anything, we'll still take, we'll take any questions or whatever. So then when someone would speak, the most traumatized were the ones that probably felt compelled to speak. So one woman came on the mic and she was like, I have a migraine and the left side of my body's numb, and like, that was really disorienting. I don't know why we didn't stop it earlier. And he was like, do you mind if I work with you? And then essentially he was, he would say, do you feel the like shimmering in your gut, or do you feel like the tension in your body somewhere? He would point to it, and they would say yes. And then he would just say, I just want you to stay there and see if you can soften into it and let me know what you notice. And then it would be like, the woman then started saying, like, after a couple of seconds, she's like, oh, my migraine has stopped. Like, I'm getting my vision back. And like, he started doing this. I actually went up to them. I was so skeptical. I'm like, maybe we're the only two people here. The rest are paid actors, like, to the person I went with. And I actually went up to a few people to ask them to see if they were like making this up. It was like watching miracles or something. It was like healing. It was amazing. And what I realized was going on there, it's just the science hasn't fully caught up. But what was going on there is, and there is actually a fair amount of research that's coming out and that has been out around group coherence. But anyway, the military uses it. In fact, Stealing Fire is an interesting book that talks about this. And in the first scene of the book, they were talking about how the military would get their folks that are in these stealth operations into a state of group coherence. So they could do dangerous, dark, like they were in the dark, and they were dangerous, and they couldn't talk, but they would almost become a single entity by going into a state of group coherence. They'd be able to move and operate without any conversation. So there's plenty of stuff that's already out there. It's not something new. It's just not necessarily mainstream research yet. But anyway, so what I think he's doing is, as I mentioned before, as he continues to heal himself, the more grounded he is, and the more that his sense of self can expand. He can actually co-regulate with people. So now the definition of self expands to everyone in the room. So I was in the program, 500 people on the call, and he was basically co-regulating with all of us. And then essentially, when he worked on each person and they grounded, they healed that part of the trauma that was triggered. And anyone else that has a similar resonant frequency trauma or sankara in their system also will feel agitation, also will clear and heal. So everyone's healing a little bit every time. And this person who has it, of course, is healing even more. But then that person becomes like a lightning rod, and they become part of the healing current, as do that part of us and so essentially it's almost like he's the higher self and we're all the like fragments. And as we heal, we're like connecting. And then as we connect, it becomes a more powerful force of good, positivity or healing that others can then more easily get healed by. So what started happening in that program when he would do each person is, I started feeling what they were describing, and I started feeling it melting within my system. And there were tears, tons of them, with every person. And I felt all this cathartic clearing. It was amazing. And I've since realized, like, in every program that he has, I've experienced that, even remotely. He did this remotely. So the last one I did a couple of weeks ago, he was doing this online with people, and I was feeling like tears come up. I even had I was hearing about other people doing it too. But so he's just able to do this, and all of us can do that. So the key is, the more I work on self, the more I heal the fragments, the deeper I'm going to go, from my individual trauma to my ancestral trauma to the collective trauma. And then that's when you start connecting with more people, places, and things, where you start to expand your sense of self. Okay. What else was going to mention around healing? So Annie Murphy Paul talks about this as in her book Extended Mind, which is a really fascinating book about how do you extend cognition. And she talks about embodied cognition, so tuning into the body, and all of these really cool examples about how that expands your intelligence. Because the body has it can actually synthesize abstract data into concrete through the body. So gestural foreshadowing is the same as fidgeting. And it's actually like, before it becomes a concrete thought, your body will synthesize it through like movement. Maybe that's why I talk with the hands so much. And then the second type she talked about was situated cognition, which was the environment you're in. So if you have a sense of belonging, you have higher intelligence. And my theory is that when you have a sense of belonging, you're actually like connecting to others. So it's almost like you have a hive mind, you have a greater collective intelligence. But then she also talked about, like, people who walk down traffic line streets had less cognition or intelligence than those that walk down tree line streets. So, are you connecting with this, like, as you're to the cell of the trees and the bees and the insects? really interesting article in Scientific American that was called "We No Longer Need Brain Cells. Simple Cells Can Do It," or "We No Longer Need Brains. Simple Cells Can Do It. Solve Problems." Fascinating article about the intelligence of insects like bees and plants. Like bees can communicate to each other in sign language. They can recognize human faces, and they can communicate the location of far-flung flowers to each other. And then they had like plants. They said like they move towards running water. If one like tree, they played a recording of a caterpillar eating the leaf, and the neighboring like trees would release mustard oil in their leaves to prevent them from being eaten by caterpillars. So all this, forget-me-nots, for example, or touch-me-nots, you touch them, they would recoil, but if you keep touching them and don't harm them, they would stop recoiling, and even a month later, they still wouldn't recoil. So, like, there's all this intelligence, and there's another video on, I don't know what it's called, it'll come to me, but I'll include it in the link, but there's a fascinating video about all of Michael Levin's research around that, but, okay, so the last thing I wanted to share was, and I'll include a separate version of this as well, is the different states of awareness. So you can get to this kind of group healing and collective healing. You can do that anytime, but you can also do this, you can become a co-regulative resource or source, and this is how it works. So, you want to start first, like, tapping into your, like, raising awareness by tapping into the language of the body or the language of the subconscious, the right mind, which is emotion and sensation. So you can do this, like, every day, every week, like with a therapist, with a friend, with yourself. You can like look at your day. What are things that really triggered you that you remember? So things that made you angry, sad, or scared, any strong emotion, negative emotion. And then you can look at it and say, when you're cooled off, like I often would do this in the evening with the kids, so I'm checking them in, or like with my therapist or whatever. And essentially you look at like, what I would do is, they share the story, like we share the story of what the thing that happened to me with this other person. And the key here, this is like a correlative, like if you're with someone who's grounded, calm, you'll usually feel really calm around them. They become a co-regulative source. So it's actually a great way. That's why therapists are so effective. They can actually help you ground out when you get triggered. They can help you ground out, and then you can look at it calmly with a conscious mind instead of subconscious like reaction. You can look at it and say like, well, what happened there? What were the patterns? What did I notice? That's why you wait till you cool off. You can also do this with someone that's, if it's very triggering, with someone that you can co-regulate with. So that's why healers and therapists and like people who are really grounded, this is like why it's very useful to do that. Easier to avoid staying in fight or flight, and being able to be more calm. And then looking at this is equanimity to sensation, same concept. It gets down the path of like all the things we want, all the way to enlightenment. But anyway, you could do this with someone, and you take a look, like, so first you share the story, what happened, and maybe it gives you a charge, and you go into a version of fight or flight. And then ideally what the other person will do for you is like what I was doing for the kids then, and what they ended up doing for me then, even more than I was doing for them, was like validating. Oh my gosh, that must have been really upsetting. That must have been really angry. Like you can ask the same kinds of questions, but the key is no judgment, no fixing, no solving. You're just validating how they feel, and you're like letting them release the charge. Yeah. I'm like, that must have been really upsetting. Yeah. Must have made you really angry. Yeah. So you're just listening, and then you're letting them release it. Then when they get back to baseline, and I got to know this with the kids when they were back to baseline, because they won't be able to do this next exercise otherwise. But then I say, like, what were you feeling? And Eckhart Tolle talked about this. The pain body comes out. It's the same thing as like your subconscious, like, Sankara rises, this version within you, Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde. That's the pain body that he's talking about. So, right, you do all these things that you can't necessarily control because your conscious mind is shut down in fight or flight. And then you might regret it later or whatever. But when you cool off, you can look at it more calmly. So he called it the pain body. The thing that he said there that I was like experimenting, worked with the kids, and then brought it everywhere else was, what were you feeling? What was the emotion? You can use the wheel of emotion. You can Google that. There's a ton of like resources to like help you start to pinpoint what are the emotions you feel. You can start really gross, anger, sadness, fear, big ones. Then as you get more nuanced, so this is what we would do. They start getting more nuanced. I'm like, oh, I feel dishonor, disrespect. And so that, that's something you could look at the emotion. Then the sensation, where do you feel it on the body? And in the beginning, you may not feel it. It might be like anger everywhere. I don't know where I felt it. But then as you start observing, you'll start noticing, just making it practice, where you start to feel it in your body. Okay, and then what you do is you play this, I call this game the game of Sherlock Holmes that I did with the kids. It's like, whatever this person did to you, whatever this thing that happened to you, multiply that by 100. That's what this person has to feel on the inside to be possible to do that thing to you. And so then it's like you play this game, like, can you suspend your disbelief about this person out to get you? And can you brainstorm anything that you don't want going on in their life, any reason they would do something like that to you. And so essentially then you're practicing like empathy. And it doesn't matter whether it's true or not, it's whether you believe there's a shadow of doubt, whether it's possible that this is true. There's a bunch of turkey vultures flying around. Yeah. The ducks are scared. Or the geese. But anyway, what was I? The Sherlock Holmes game. So then you can essentially start to look at like shadow of a doubt. So I'm not fundamentally flawed. The world's not an evil place. This person's having a bad day. That's why they did this thing to me. You know, so that's the first stage. Trying to practice that on a regular basis. So you can start to both tune in to your higher self, your intuition, and open that channel, because that's going to be the best life coach and guide you could ever imagine. Everything else is a poor substitute, because they'll be able to most effectively, efficiently, like I'm experiencing, take you down all the things that you ever dreamed and want, your purpose in life, everything. This comes with connecting to your higher self. So that's the first way to start opening that channel and raising your awareness. Okay, and the second stage is indulgence, I called it. So this is what I was doing here was, when something would trigger me, let's say I come home from work and I'm really upset about something that happened, it's like, normally I'd be like, you shouldn't be angry, like, you know, tuck it onto a carpet or try to be zen or whatever. And then for like a week or two, I'd be like snapping at the kids or like irritable or whatever, like things would come up and I'd be more agitated and angry. Then I was like, well, what would happen if I indulge or entertain? Like, if I could have whatever I wanted, assuming within reason here. If I want to kill someone, obviously that's not within reason. But let's say what I wanted, I think I mentioned this in the first video too, is like chocolate and iced tea or whatever. Sit in bed, cry, like curl up with a blanket and cry, like whatever. I'm like, well, why don't I do that? What would happen? Let's try that. So I did that, and what I've realized is, as I've mentioned in a previous video, these sankharas, as they grow, these traumas, they become like beings within us. These are all fractals here. So it's literally like a kid within you that's like crying for your attention, that's really upset or sad from that, you know, that dimension, that they're living that trauma. That's their reality. And now it's yours too, if you get triggered. So essentially it's like, can you honor and like embrace, indulge that spoiled child or whatever, how you want to think about it, with whatever they want and see what happens. So what started happening for me was I'd sit in bed and I would eat all the chocolate and iced tea Snapple peach iced tea I could think of. But it's like, I got sick of it. Like after a couple days or then it became a day, then it became some hours, and then I actually started going to minutes. And when I'd notice at the end of it, and then I would be like, what if I feel like crying? Instead of suppressing it, I shouldn't cry or it's too embarrassing. I'd just go on my own in my room or whatever, go in the car, and I would cry my heart out until there wasn't a single tear left to cry. And then it's like, and then what I noticed was, I get to this place that I would describe, I thought was a depression, an emptiness. It's okay, buddy, come here. Depression or like and I started calling it, I realized instead of that, it was the void. And if I just held space for it, then, you know, and didn't go do anything, then what would start happening is I would basically, I would then suddenly get a download of insights, and I'd feel some kind of a physical release, and I feel like I jumped to the next level of the Mario Brothers game, ready for the next challenge. So this is like stage 2. Can you indulge, you know, what's going on? And then what you can also do here is, the system it's always very intelligent. It's always seeking healing and balance. So the reason I crave chocolate and a Snapple peach iced tea, for example, is maybe when there was good times, like, you know, you think about birthday parties and celebrations, usually sweet things there. So it's no surprise that you're craving sugar. Your system's like, ooh, you're feeling bad, you're stressed. Let me pick something up from the library of tools, like chocolate works. Eat chocolate. So you may not have an exposure to other things. So what I learned from a book I read, it was on Ayurveda, which is another amazing methodology for healing. But this book that I read, I don't remember the name of it now. But anyway, what they talked about was like, notice how you feel 20 minutes after you eat. There's some reason your body is craving that thing. It's trying to soothe itself. It's trying to like heal, balance, you know, reduce the stress. It doesn't have a judgment about whether it's good or bad for you per se. So they said like, just notice 20 minutes after you eat, how do you feel? And then I started noticing was like, and they had a whole list of like 21 different terms or whatever. I was like lethargic and bloated 20 minutes later after eating chocolate. But if I eat strawberries, I felt refreshed and like energized or whatever. Like, so then what starts happening is what wires together. So instead of associating chocolate with good things, I started associating with like, ew, like I feel ill, like bloated. That's what I started associating with chocolate. So then when I would get stressed, not every time, you know, it takes time to change the neural pathways, I started craving strawberries more of the time, or things that were good for me. So part of it's giving your system an exposure. So you don't want to force, right? That doesn't work. That creates more trauma and more sankharas, and it reinforces trauma. So, but you want to kind of nudge yourself or expose yourself to other things so that your system can leverage its own intelligence to like seek things that might help you get to better places. Okay, so that's the second stage. The third stage that I discovered was when I like learned from Thomas Hubel, as I mentioned, like feeling where in the body my trigger, and if it's a big enough trigger, right? So small triggers I can't feel, my mind's not sharp enough to do that. Come here. My mind's not sharp enough to do that. So essentially it's like, if they're really big ones, if I can catch it early or even after the fact, but ideally during, then I can actually, soften into it, like being with the kid. It's like being with a kid that's like wanting attention, like this little guy. Come here, buddy. Come here. Come here. Come, sit. Come. There you go. Come. Come. Sit. Sit. Good job. There you go. Come here. Come here. Sit down. There you go. Come sit. Come sit. There you go. Okay. All right. So it's like in the third stage, it's like feeling into the body where the sensation's coming from. So when I get triggered, instead of judging it, trying to get rid of it, you think of it like a little kid that just wants your attention. They just want your full attention. Right, buddy? They just want your full attention, and that's often what all they need. And so just try not to get rid of it. This is almost thinking like a little kid, or a friend or a little brother or sister that's looking for your attention and support. You need to be there with them. Try to become friends with it instead of trying to judge it, heal it, fix it, remove it. And then if you're able to do that, just start to notice what are the texture, color, flavors of like the trauma or the sensation in your body. Just like get curious about it and see what it feels like. If you're able to do that, then you could actually start to take a couple of deep breaths where the exhale is a little bit longer than the inhale, and you'll basically be able to relax it and release it from the system. And then you start getting insights and wisdom, which is what started happening for me about what's going on and why it's happening, why you see it as a trauma and so on, or a negative triggering experience. And the last stage, the fourth stage, is what I learned at the Santa Dami Church when I learned how to transmute dark energy into light. And that's basically, the trick is, when you develop enough equanimity and awareness, this is much more easy, which is why it's a later stage in the game. But essentially then it's like when you start discerning what's the voice of the ego and the sankharas, and what's the voice of the heart or spirit, right? This will be like positive, love, compassion, goodwill. These will be negative, judgment, criticism, negativity. When you start being able to discern that and pick it up, you basically come to the heart anytime there's a negative thought, judgment, criticism, etc. And then ground your root chakra, your Sushumna, into the center of the earth. Imagine a stake in the ground, as I mentioned. Your central channel into the earth, and then open your heart, symbol of the cross, which is sacred geometry. Open your heart and focus in the center. That's love. Highest frequency can transmute anything. And so essentially then if you just bring it back to the heart, any negative thought that I have now, judgment, criticism, I focus on my heart and ground my Sushumna, ground my energy. And then it starts to dissolve. So slowly that'll start dissolving too. That's the last stage. So those are the 4 stages of increasing your awareness and being able to heal your own trauma. And then the last one, I guess, is when you become a co-regulative force. When you heal enough of your trauma, the fragments, you can start becoming a healer, a co-regulative force for others. And that's when all the fun really begins. All right, I'll talk to you later. Bye.